Thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you all here. This is the first of our Beckley Academy webinars focusing on approaches to psychedelic assisted therapy. This will be the first in a series of 3 webinars. The next 2 are coming next month. This one will be focusing on a variety of topics, and a lot of it will focus on a certain relational lens that we bring to our work. There'll be some wonderful folks on our team in conversation with our head of education, Deb Gardner. I'm going to wait a few more minutes for people to file in from the waiting room before diving into introductions. I can start with some basic information about Beckley Academy for those of you who may not know. At Beckley Academy, we provide transformative education to psychedelic practitioners. We have been working over the course of the last 2 years to train cohorts of folks looking to integrate psychedelic assisted therapy into their practice. We are part of the larger Beckley ecosystem, working from a variety of different perspectives. The Beckley Academy is in many ways informed by the research that Amanda Fielding has been doing with Beckley Foundation for multiple decades. We're also connected to Beckley Retreats, the Trip Report, a variety of other organizations within that larger Beckley ecosystem. Looks like we have a lot of folks piling in. I'll get going with a brief introduction for our team and faculty. Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Deborah Gardner, our head of education, as well as 2 faculty members, Mary Sanders and Sarah Gale. My name is Kabir. I am our manager of learner experience. I also work on the enrollment side of things. If any of you end up taking a course with us, we'll surely interact lots. And then we also have Alec on, who is providing support on a lot of our marketing efforts. At this point, I will hand off to Deb to give a more thorough introduction. But before that, briefly running through our agenda. Again, welcome and introduction. So we'll dive into the panel discussion next for about 30 minutes, and then we'll wrap up with 20 minutes of Q&A. During the panel discussion, please hold your questions till the end. Feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them later. And then when we get to the Q&A part, feel free to use the hand raise function, and we'll facilitate and make sure we can answer as many questions before we lead into the information on our upcoming spring cohorts, and then 5 minutes of closing. All right, Deb, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Kabir. And thanks everybody for being here. And Alec, if you could spotlight, me and Mary and Sarah, that would be fantastic. And we'll leave this slide up just for a moment here before we take it down. Awesome, thank you. So as Kabir was saying, actually, could you put that slide back up for just this first part, please? As Kabir was saying, this is a 3-part webinar series that we're holding with our faculty. And we're lucky enough to have Mara and Sarah here today for this conversation. This particular conversation is about the relational approach to psychedelic assisted therapy. And so we're going to be looking at ecological systems, which is essentially relationship to self, to others, and the world as it relates to psychedelic assisted therapy. And as Kabir said, I'm the head of education here at Beckley Academy. I have about 17 years in the education industry. I worked as a teacher of students with learning differences for about 6 years when I first started teaching, and then spent about a decade in sensory motor psychotherapy, which is a somatic trauma-based therapy. And so this conversation about healing happening in relationship, harm happening in relationship, how this relates to non-ordinary states of consciousness and psychedelic work is particularly close to my heart. And I will go ahead and let you 2 introduce yourselves. And Sarah, if you want to go first, if you'd let us know a little bit about you, please.
Sure, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Good to see you and be here with you. My name is Sarah Gale, and I am a psychedelic therapist trainer and mentor. I've been working in this field for about 14 years now. I've worked at the nonprofit of MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and I've also worked on the clinical trials in MDMA assisted therapy for MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which is now known as Lykos Therapeutics. I also have background in ketamine assisted therapy, as well as peer support and psychedelic harm reduction. And I've been spending the last few years really teaching and providing mentorship in this field. I really love working with people who are exploring different work in this psychedelic ecosystem. And I come from a transpersonal lens and background, as well as developmental. I had my master's degree from Naropa University. And yeah, so that's a little bit about the work that I do, and excited to engage in this conversation with you all.
Thank you, Sarah. And Mary?
Hi, welcome everyone. It's really a treat to be here and spend the afternoon. It's rainy and cold in Oakland, California, which is a rare occasion, but welcoming as much rain as we can get here. My name is Mary Sanders. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've worked in the last 10 years in community mental health, serving diverse communities of color, folks that identify as LGBTQIA+, refugees, immigrants, the foster youth, and really pivoted my work into psychedelics when I learned of these amazing technologies to heal PTSD, as well as depression and other disorders, and also as a tool for personal growth. And so in my work, I just really was observing so much transgenerational trauma, and it made me curious of what are the possibilities of not only healing our trauma that we've experienced, but healing the trauma that our ancestors experienced. And so really excited to have this conversation. I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner. Also recently got trained in IFS. And really like to hang out in the spaces where psychedelic medicine interacts with community organizing, thinking about intersectionality, equity, and how do we integrate these medicines where communities can provide the sustainable ongoing support of integration. So such a treat, and thank you for this invitation, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. We're really in for a treat here. So I want to start by saying that Beckley Academy changed the name of our foundational psychedelic assisted therapy course to really highlight the importance of relationship and a relational approach to psychedelic assisted therapy. And maybe we can start with just this assumption that learning and healing happen in relationship. And the converse of that, right, which is that harm, right, trauma, things like that, also happen in relationship. I wonder if you two could talk just briefly about, your reflection of that, of the importance of relationship in general in psychedelic assisted therapy.
All right, I can kick us off.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think what comes to mind for me right away is that when we're talking about healing, it's kind of what emerges for me is what is healing, right? And how do we perceive the healing process? And just as you were speaking to how trauma happens in relationship and healing happens in relationship, the word that emerges for me is connection. And I think that we can't really talk about individual healing without simultaneously talking about collective healing. And the reality that we are living with, as Mary mentioned in her introduction, generations of trauma and transgenerational, intergenerational experiences that have been handed down from one generation to the next. And that we're living in this system, and it's really the water that we all swim in, that is very, if we're thinking about modernity and sort of the more reductionist, rational approach that we in modern society really live in, oftentimes experience a sense of disconnection, right? And so a lot of times when we're working with our clients, I'm sure many on this call can resonate with, feeling like our clients and ourselves are often struggling with this connection to others and connection with self. And so I believe that, healing is really this process of reconnection. And but it's not just reconnecting after, your own personal disconnection, but also generations of disconnection that we are really healing from collectively. And so when I'm working with a client, whether it's with psychedelics or otherwise, I'm always having that in mind. And that's part of the transpersonal psychology lens, is really taking that perspective, that more systems and systemic perspective, that we can't just treat the individual, that when we're sitting with an individual, they are bringing with them all of those patterns and all of those stories that are coming from the society that we live within. And so I think that is, for me, that is important to remember when I'm working with clients, is that I'm there to help to serve as a place of, first of all, the relational connection, right, which we're going to talk about a lot today, is the connection between the therapist and the client, and how that connection can be healing in and of itself, and how that can be supported through the psychedelic experience and through access of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And just that idea that we're really helping our clients and supporting them in reconnecting with themselves, so that they can then extend that connection out to others in their life.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm so glad that you brought up transgenerational community, right? And that can be present there in the room. And Mary, you had touched on that a little bit too in your introduction. Maybe you could speak a little more to that.
Yes, thank you. Often when I'm teaching, I leave our group with a quote from Bell Hooks, and she says, "Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion." And I really hold that close to my heart, because it's this remembering that we are moving and within our communities, within our families, but also with all the living beings surrounding us, the connection to the earth, to the trees, to all the animals. And so as I continue to go deeper in the medicine, that has been one of my most powerful lessons, is connecting to ourselves while also.
Hey, good. Are you? Did you get an order for Raj?
Let's see here.
I think so. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Can you mute?
I think we have some maybe attendees who need to mute.
Okay, great. So so not only connecting to ourselves, but being able to then connect to our ancestors, and being able to connect in ways that we can support that healing, that we can be able to support the resources that they did not have, or really listening in to their needs. And then sometimes also letting go, right, of some of the ancestral harms that we've been carrying. And so I really love the idea of really looking, like you mentioned earlier, from the ecological perspective, because not only are we doing this healing work, as Sarah mentioned, so deeply with our practitioners, wherever that might be, is that we're navigating our everyday communities. And we have not only the impact to, we have the ability to then share that with our friends, with our families, or the systems that we're interacting with every day. And so, I just like to offer that. I see for myself the abilities to move differently with my family and to respond differently, and create a kind of a different path of communication, a different path of relating, in ways that maybe there wasn't enough space or time. Also, wasn't access to these. To therapy or to these technologies. So I'll just end there.
Yeah, thank you. And as you both were talking, I'm thinking too about the flip side of this, right? Which is that harm also happens in relationship. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, what are the various relational harms that therapists who are thinking about practicing psychedelic assisted therapy need to know about, that are likely to show up? And then what do you need to consider in terms of like how you in the room can either sort of perpetuate those harms or interrupt them? Whoever would like to go first.
It's always awkward on Zoom. It's like trying to read body language. Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. Yeah, I feel like, so for me, a lot of my training and background has been with trauma and PTSD. And so the clinical trials that I've worked on were with MDMA, those trials are with trauma. And so that's a lot of what I have focused my work on. And I really, and I know a lot of our colleagues here will likely share in this perspective, believe that trauma is really at the root of so many other issues, right? So when our clients are coming to us with depression or anxiety or the list goes on, that often what we're finding underneath is some sort of trauma. So that might be PTSD, it might be actual diagnosed or diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder, or it just might be the fact that we're humans and we're alive here on this planet, and this is a hard place to be. And so we've all experienced trauma to varying degrees. And obviously, there are communities and populations that have endured higher rates of trauma, and those include, Black, Indigenous people of color, LGBTQI plus populations, as well as many others. And so, but when we think about these traumas, I think oftentimes, and I think I'm guilty of this when I was first becoming a therapist, I just thought, oh, okay, trauma happens to us on the individual level, on the biographical level of things that I've experienced in my lifetime. Or in my clients' lifetimes. And then over the years and, developing my practice, my own personal practice and working with clients, beginning to really see those larger spaces and what you're speaking to of, how harms can be enacted and at various scales. And so I kind of think of it as like, I'll probably leave one out here, but on the biographical scale, there's things that we have experienced ourselves in our own personal lifetime. Then there's things that we've witnessed and things that our family and our communities have endured. And then there's whole community, whole societal traumas, right? There's entire races and ethnicities who have experienced traumas, genocides. And so there's that lens. And then there's bigger traumas, which are, speaking back to what Mary mentioned around the ecological, right? And the fact that we are currently living in this environmental crisis and that we're experiencing traumas that are happening to beyond the human, right? That are happening on an ecological level, but that nonetheless impact us since this is our home. This is the place that we live. And so when things happen on an ecological level, that also impacts us. One of the things that I've seen with psychedelic work is that all of those different areas can be accessed with psychedelics. So I might have a client who with the support of the medicine, they're accessing and processing and working through emotions and sensations and experiences that they had in their own personal life. But one of the really fascinating and unique things that I've seen with psychedelics that I haven't seen as much with other forms of therapy, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but haven't seen it as much, is that access to the bigger collective traumas, the collective humanity, and as well as the bigger ecological pieces. And I've seen that both in my work as a therapist with ketamine and with MDMA, and also in the harm reduction work that I did with MAPS and the Zendo project, where people would come in who had taken psychedelics in what we might refer to a recreational setting, right, a festival or event, and they're accessing this big thing that they didn't expect, and all of a sudden they find themselves needing support. And what they're accessing is something that is much bigger than just their biographical experience. And so I have found that very fascinating, that psychedelics can help us access those places and also help us process and move through those experiences. And I think that it's very powerful to support and witness someone as they're processing on any of those levels.
Yeah, and one of the things that came up, or Mary, maybe you have a response right away, or I have a follow-up question.
Oh, I no, go right ahead.
Okay. One of the things that came up while you were talking is this I think the vulnerability, right? The client, you've mentioned this, both of you have. The client is in this very vulnerable state. There's all this potential to contact and work through some of these experiences, either direct or indirect, right? And the therapist has this potential as well to be a part of that healing process, right? To sort of provide that missing relational experience, or not, right? And I think one of the things that would be interesting to talk about, maybe you can speak to this, Mary, is what's in that vulnerability, and how does the therapeutic relationship, how can it help sort of support growth from that state and reduce harm from that state?
Great, thank you for the question. And I'm just going to tap a little bit into the last question too, because when we're thinking, when I often think as a practitioner of harm, sometimes I'm thinking of these times of misattunement, right? When I wasn't, as present as I would like to have been, or I missed something there. And in traditional therapy, right, oftentimes we're seeing the client the next week, and we can really reflect what happened in the last session, or where we might have misstepped or misspoke, and we can do that healing work, which is such an opportunity to deepen, the relationship as well. So I wanted to name that, but what I also wanted to name is that in the work, when we're thinking of harm, we also want to think about the ways in which we are building trust in the relationship to reduce harm. And so that might be, right, really looking at our conversations and creating spaciousness to talk about our own identities, right, and talk about our worldviews, to really name, we have different gender identities, or we come from different backgrounds. There's a power differentiation here. Can we have that, would you be open to that conversation? And that's something I have invited more and more in my therapeutic work. And I will say 10 years ago, when I was trained as a social worker, that wasn't, that wasn't one of our main trainings, even as a social worker, where you're diving into deep, diverse communities and really looking at systems. And so I really want to put that forward, because as therapists, as healers, practitioners, now add that layer of medicine, that layer of vulnerability, we really want to kind of have that trust there and enhance that safety, so that those parts that are deep down in there that want to be heard, want to be expressed, feel the sense of safety, like this person can really hold me. They can handle it, regardless of our differences of gender, or regardless of our difference of race or ethnicity. I trust that this is a possibility for me. I have been in spaces, and more like white dominated ayahuasca spaces, where I thought, I don't know, my ancestors who were enslaved, I really want to talk about it, but I'm afraid. Can this space hold that? And so I really want to name the importance of those conversations, creating that dialogue, and really for the practitioner to open that, right? So we don't want the burden to be on our clients to say like, oof, I really want to talk about this, but I'm not sure. And so I want to name that. And I also want to name that when we are, you mentioned, when we are in these places of vulnerability with medicine, and sometimes even without medicine, we're just, the protectors have gone down, the little ones are forward, that 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 we've already built that trust. We are grounded in our bodies, right? We have taken care of ourselves. We are resourced so that we can provide that care, right? That unconditional love and care. And I think what you mentioned earlier, Deb, was the missing, what didn't happen. And it could be, right? What didn't happen is receiving that love, that care, that kindness, that grounded presence, right? That I'm not scared, I'm not worried, you're not too much, I'm here for you in this moment. And so, we have the opportunity to bear witness, but also maybe even move towards completion, allowing to what needs to be discharged and let go and released, right? Allowing that to be a possibility. and being able to support that, right, with this grounded presence.
Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, did you want to respond to that? Or we could move on to the next part.
I was so deeply listening to Mary's question that I don't even remember what the question was. So maybe we could just move on to the next.
That's perfect. So we're really starting to get more into the therapeutic relationship, right? The therapeutic dance, the co-created container, all these different words that we have really to try to describe something that is not so tangible, right? It's that, the therapist, the client, the medicine, the setting, all these other things that we've named that are kind of coming together. I would love if you two would just talk, each of you, a little bit about how you envision the therapeutic container, the therapeutic relationship, as it relates to psychedelic assisted therapy.
I'll
Mary,
jump
do you want
in.
to kick off?
Yeah, I was like,
Thanks,
I'm
Mary.
just like, I'll jump in. Yeah, so I often, as I mentioned earlier, I move with this medicine in my work and really like in my relationships now with a somatic lens. And what I've learned to be so powerful with that practice is really slowing things down, allowing, even like the setup as we sit down in therapy together, allowing as much time as needed for my clients, even for myself, to get in a place of just comfort and support. And what I really like to focus on is what are the little ways that we can move in therapy to show that I am witnessing you, that I am along with you on this journey. I am honoring and listening to your boundaries. I am trusting that you know exactly what you need. And so moving with that lens, and moving with that slowness, I feel like moving into the medicine space, it really helps build that trust over time. And so in the typical session, I might ask, and maybe this is familiar to a lot of the practitioners here that work with the somatic lens, like, how is this for you? I can move closer or further away. How is this space? How does it feel in here? Let's look around. We might be able to shift a couple of things here and there. And while this might just seem, so casual and like, why is this important? For me, it's the little things, right? The client is getting to know me, getting to know that we are not in a rush here. That you have the right to tell me to move away or come closer, and then it might be a conversation, but it gives us, kind of shifts that power differentiation, but also builds the trust from the beginning, from the initial conversations, from the initial sitting down together. And then, of course, like, right, we can go deeper over time, but I really just like to highlight the small, ways that we are witnessing each other and supporting each other.
Yeah. I really appreciate that you named this strategy, right, for really empowering the client, this co-creative process that happens oftentimes in preparation or before dosing sessions, because that is so significant in the therapeutic relationship. And then Sarah, I'd love to hear from you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to build upon that, and this is a term that we share a lot in this training and that many of you have heard of, which is that inner healing intelligence, or that inner directed process. That is such a part of this work. And as you were speaking, Mary, that was what emerged. One of the things that emerged for me is that in this work, so this concept of inner directed process or inner healing intelligence didn't necessarily originate with psychedelics. Stan Grof definitely popularized the term in the psychedelic field. But the idea that we have an inner wisdom, right, that we have an inner guide, is so ancient and cross-cultural and has showed up in so many wisdom traditions throughout time, right? We can find some reference to this inner wisdom, this inner guide. And the idea that when we are working with our clients, that our role is really in a big way to help them to connect to that part of themselves. And then we're not the expert in the room, right? We might have training, we might have background, and that is very important. It's important to have tools and strategies and have trained and developed your capacity to hold that container and hold the space for our clients. But really what I see my role as a practitioner is really to optimize the potential for my clients to access that inner wisdom, inner healer. And in our society, I think we're so distracted, right? We're often looking outside of ourselves for the answers. And that's something that is very much sort of kind of reinforced in many kind of, whether it's religious systems or just consumerism, just the idea that, that something out there is going to come and fix me or save me or make me better. And so the idea that as practitioners that, yeah, we're really there to bring a mirror and to provide reflection for, and witnessing our so I call them participants because I work so much in research, our clients' process, right? And witnessing is so powerful, as Mary was speaking to, just the process of witnessing itself. Right. For those of us who've been witnessed by a therapist or by a good friend, so much of that is just transformative in and of itself. And then when our clients are accessing these expanded states of consciousness and these deeper awarenesses, to be witnessed in that place of vulnerability is really powerful. So just to speak a little bit to that inner directed process and inner healer. And then the last thing I want to speak to for this question is really also that so much of our work is, as practitioners, is doing our own personal work. And I think that this is true for all types of therapy, but I have in psychedelic therapy, it's really above and beyond in my experience. And I think part of that is because in those non-ordinary states of consciousness, we are opening into this field where our clients really can sense a lot more than they would normally. So my experience as a practitioner in this work is that I can't hide, that my work is always practicing to learn how I can be more authentic, how I can be more vulnerable and show up in that space with my clients. And that's a huge shift from how psychology and psychotherapy has been over the past 100 or so years, of this sort of like removed expert position. And so it really calls us, this work really calls us as practitioners into doing our own personal work so that we can, remove our own obstacles to connection, right? Of which there might be many that keep us out of connection. And so doing that is an ongoing process. It's a lifelong process, and it expands so many areas, right? Personal development, personal growth, expands everything from that could be getting your own therapy and going through your own process and making sure that you're attending to your own trauma, as well as receiving additional training or education and things like working cross-culturally and working with those who are from different identities than our own, as Mary mentioned too earlier. So that's another piece that comes to mind when I think about building the container, is that, that is such a part of it for me as a practitioner, is consistently attending to my own work and never deluding myself that I'm ever going to be finished with it, because it really is a forever process.
Yeah, and it goes nicely into our final prompt here for this section, which is really about therapeutic enactment or transference and countertransference, right? So what's happening below the surface between the therapist, between the client. And I'd love to hear just your strategies for tracking what's happening beneath the surface for your client, for you. And if you have any sort of example, of moments where you noticed, your own stuff coming up and sort of how you negotiated that, I think that would be interesting too. Whoever would like to start first, Mary?
Great. Yeah, I'll hop in. I'm so grateful, Sarah, that you brought up the importance of doing our inner work. So often young practitioners ask me, where should I start? Where should I start? And I'm like, start, with therapy, with connecting to nature, breath work, also deepening your own relationship with medicine and these non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so I think so much of our learning, and just like we did in therapy school and you know, and these specific trainings like somatic experiencing or IFS, is that we are practicing on ourselves first, right? We're working in dyads and triads and like learning how to work with this material. And in that process, right, by witnessing our colleagues and our colleagues witnessing us, we're able to learn these skills around tracking, really being able to learn about how to track others while I'm tracking myself, right? And this is something we have to practice, and we have to, and it takes time, and so, and you know, and we're gonna make mistakes, right? And we're gonna do that repair work with our clients. And so I think it's so important for us to be able to kind of notice the changes within ourselves, to track the changes that are happening, the shifts, and that way we have, and then we're doing that with our clients, whether that is in traditional therapy, whether that is if we're a meditation practitioner or a yoga practitioner, we're holding that space, and we're building up that skill. And so for some, you know, often, right, we're looking at the eyes, we're looking at how the face changes, we're looking at how the body moves. And we're also, right, often we're matching our clients, or sometimes we're bringing them down, right, with our voices, and sometimes we're bringing them up with our voices, or the ways that we're moving, and acting as that resource in the medicine space. Similarly to what we're doing in our everyday work as well as a therapist. And so I really love the question around like what are the ways that we're engaging in these nonverbal communications, right? Underneath the layer, like you mentioned, because we're doing that every day, right? We're doing that when we are at Target waiting in line. There's that agitation. That person next to us is feeling that. And so, as Sarah mentioned earlier, that we can't hide from it. And so we really have to resource ourselves. What are the ways that I'm caring for myself during you know, a session and traditional talk therapy? But what does that look like when it's 6 to 8 hours? How am I caring for myself? What are my strategies? You know, is it my connection to breath? Is it my hand on my heart? Is it the way that I'm sitting that's most supportive? And so really being attuned, you know, to ourselves so that we can, you know, create that container that you're mentioning, but also being aware of what we're communicating underneath the verbal language, in which we know so much of the communication in that space is non.
Mary might have froze. Is nonverbal beneath the surface. I think it's where we lost you. So much of that communication is below the surface, I think you were saying.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. I got lost there for a second.
Did you have any more to add, Mary?
No, I don't. I'm
Okay.
sorry for that.
It's okay. That's okay. Thank you. And Sarah, did you want to respond to that too?
Yeah, I can just build off that a little bit. That yeah, I think that so much, as Mary mentioned, so much of the process is a nonverbal, non-linguistic. So many of, I think, us as practitioners as well as our clients might be very used to talk therapy and narrative. And in my experience, my clients often know their stories really well, right? Sometimes they have a lot of practice in talking about their trauma, talking about their experiences and what happened to them. And they're coming to me as a psychedelic practitioner because that hasn't worked. There's something about that hasn't quite gotten them to where they want to be in their healing journey, right? And so I think that we're really learning now so much with somatic therapy and with work like internal family systems and parts work, how so much of the work that needs to happen is beyond the verbal. And we're a very kind of word and verbal focused, I think, society. And so yeah, so much of the work is really, as Mary mentioned, tuning into our own and tracking our own experience so that we can then, when we know what's going on for us in our body and noticing our sensations and noticing our emotional state, we can better track that for our clients. And also to really remember that so much of trauma experienced beyond language, especially traumas that were experienced, whether that is younger in age developmentally, or kind of what we were speaking to earlier around those more collective or transgenerational traumas. There's often not a narrative to it. And that can be very uncomfortable for newer practitioners to this work, as well as our clients, because there's an element, I think, of control that can happen when we just stay on that verbal level. And that isn't to say that it's not very helpful and supportive to talk about our experiences, but what I've seen is that sometimes the more vulnerable or challenging work that can really go into addressing some of the root causes of, enduring challenging symptoms in their lives year after year with many of our clients, is getting to that underneath those layers and really working through and processing on an emotional and on a somatic level. And so I love the discussion and this is part of this training, and the discussion of complementary modalities, and the idea that each one of you listening to this webinar comes with your own background and your own experience. And you might also, if you pursue psychedelic work, you might also decide to receive additional training in other complementary modalities. So things like somatic work and IFS, and things like art therapy and nature-based therapy. There's a lot of different other modalities that really blend and support well with psychedelic work. And so one of my kind of favorite things is just seeing how different people with different gifts and background and experiences will bring their existing work to complement this psychedelic work.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. And I'm so glad that you highlighted the importance of sort of knowing your own nervous system, knowing sort of how to track nervous systems around you, and really the healing potential that's in that, which is a big part of the course at Beckley Academy. So that brings to a close our discussion part. Aside from Q&A, we're happy to take questions. And why don't we go ahead and unpin us from, or unspotlight us so we can see faces. Feel free to throw questions in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. We are happy to answer questions. Here. Well, I have a follow-up question as we're waiting. We talked a little bit about the missing experience and the therapist being able to provide that missing experience. It's also something that we talk about in education, where the teacher, as the more knowing other, is able to provide enough guidance, right? And sort of provide that other way of being, right? That might be different from what that child has experienced or what that client has experienced. If one of you could speak a little bit more to, the healing potential of that would be interesting to me. Either Mary or Sarah. Sarah.
Yeah, I'll just go for it. Yeah. I'm glad that you asked this, because I think we talked around it, but I don't know if we necessarily touched on attachment. And this is in my experience, such a big part of this work is, and healing from trauma in general, psychedelic or otherwise, is this, healing our attachment wounds and attending to those places where we didn't receive what we needed. And sometimes when we're talking about trauma, we often talk more about the traumas of admission, right? The things that happened to us. But trauma also occurs with traumas of omission, things that we didn't receive, and things like nurturing or protection. And so, as a practitioner in this work, I do see that I think it's connected to the piece that you brought up, Deb, around vulnerability, that people do often access the transference very it's more pronounced, right? So when we talk about psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy, we're often talking about that we call psychedelics non-specific amplifiers, and the fact that they amplify the experience. And so that happens a lot with transference as well as with countertransference. And so I think that it is helpful in this work, I think in all therapy work, to see that as a tool, right? Transference is an opportunity. It's not something that's getting in the way of the therapeutic relationship. It's something that is an opportunity that's inviting in the present moment, that enactment, like you're speaking to. And so that's one of the things that I've seen with this work, is just the amplification of that transference, especially as it relates to things like attachment wounds. And it is true that oftentimes in this work, our clients, I think it's a combination of the depth and the connection that occurs with the practitioner. There's a depth of connection and relationship that can occur in, for me, for clients that I've seen without psychedelics, it could take months or years to get there, and sometimes a couple sessions, and it feels like we have this deep connection and relationship, and that is beautiful. It's amazing, and it brings about great responsibility as a practitioner to tend to that amplified relationship in a way that is like we've been speaking to, that is non-harming, right? So being in the reality that we are in that therapist-client relationship, that this is a somehow likely time-limited dynamic, and we might work with that person for weeks or potentially years, but as is more common in this work is for clients to come to us to have a few sessions, deeper sessions, and then there is a termination. And so often I've seen that termination in and of itself can also be a gateway, that so many times our clients have experienced wounding in endings, right? Things ending in their life where they didn't have control or they didn't have a say, whether that was people dying or relationships ending. And so there's an opportunity for empowerment in the termination of treatment, if it's done in a way that is very sensitive and tending to the reality of that heightened attachment, and really honoring that does occur. And so I don't think it's not a bad thing that our clients attach to us, and that we can experience that too. We just need to make sure that we're navigating that with so much care and love and presence.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love that you touched on sort of closings or endings, right? That transitional period, because there's a lot of power in that. We actually touch on that in our course a little bit too. Here's a question. And Mary, maybe you'd like to answer this one, let me know. So if you make a mistake while holding space and accidentally cause harm, hurt the person, make them feel uneasy, how do you navigate that rupture and that repair? And either one of you.
I'll just speak more about kind of some of my harm reduction work and in the Zendo with Sarah, with some of Sarah's work that she does at Burning Man. When providing right support for an individual in non-ordinary states, and not being able and not having this long-term relationship or this, a lot of background or a lot of history, there's a lot more potential of, I think, of making mistakes. And I think one of my kind of often of how I move in these spaces where I don't know a client or a participant well is moving slowly, being attentive. And when there is a misattunement, acknowledging that and providing the space, if there is verbal communication, providing this space for processing. I think what's important is the acknowledgement piece. When we are in these states, right, they are extensive periods of time. So there might be a time where we leave, for getting, to get water, get food, and we think that it's an okay time. It appears that it is a good time, and maybe even the person related to that. But there might have been a sense of abandonment that can come through, right? Or something else that might have been missed. And so I think for myself is being, having the container in which we can be open to name that there was a misattunement or a misunderstanding or, or a different situation, and being humbled in that process, and allowing for that repair to happen. And sometimes it might also come through in the integration session where there was a little bit more time for reflection, and maybe a little more time to process what might have occurred. And I think, often we're doing this in our traditional talk therapy. And as I mentioned before, we get to see that client the next week, or, we're only together for that 1 hour. And it's a very different experience when we're sitting with someone for 6 hours. And there's a lot more opportunity for us to kind of feel restless, kind of fall into boredom, right? And so I think bringing to that awareness for ourselves that there are going to be things that we may not have noticed and that might come up later in integration.
I love that you've given me a visual of the therapist matching the vulnerability with the humility, in that answer. So I appreciate that. Another question here is, how do you navigate the indigenous history of psychedelics, considering that psychedelic assisted therapy is happening in the medical or mental health model?
Yeah, I can dive into that. I mean, for me, I think I see two domains. And for me, like as a teacher, because I've been training in this work for the past 3 years, so kind of how I approach that as an actual, trainer and facilitator, and then there's how I work with my clients. And so I see them as those domains as interconnected and related. There's kind of like a Vesica Pisces there. And so I think that for me, this goes back to that inner work. It goes back to doing my own work around understanding, cultural humility. And once again, that lifelong process of learning about both the cultures of my clients as well as the cultures of that these medicines, many of them came from, especially if they're plant medicines. I particularly have focused on and worked mostly in my practice on MDMA and ketamine, which have been used, often in the West. But I think that we also have to talk not just about the medicine, but about the practices too, right? So we were talking about inner healing intelligence earlier. And so I think that it's also important to reference and talk about the many different wisdom traditions and indigenous practices that have influenced just the field of psychology in general. I think often we can get very myopic and we can think, oh, just Western psychology, it was formed in this little insulated kind of way, but it has been so informed by so many traditions over time. So for me, it's always about knowing if there's a way that I'm practicing or if there's approach that I'm using, really understanding and seeking to understand. I don't want to say understand because that seems like it's very finite and like, oh, I understand, check. But more like seeking to develop a curiosity with and a relationship with indigenous practices. And so, I mean, I feel like IFS is a great example of that, right? Like internal family systems and parts work. We have Dick Schwartz, we have that model. But the idea that we have multiple parts that emerge, that's an ancient idea, right? That has emerged throughout cultures, and in fact was very vilified for so many years. And it was very much put in this way. If we think about like what was referred to as what is now referred to as dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities. And so recognizing that a lot of the approaches, the therapy approaches that we use today have roots, deep historical roots, and then oftentimes some version of those were actually oppressed or outright subjected to, very cruel sometimes. I mean, I think about, even in the West, I think about witchcraft, right? And just the history of witchcraft. So I know that that's like a very big thing that seems a little bit beyond psychedelics, but I do think that it's important to also name that it's about the psychedelic medicines, but also about the tools and the approaches that we use as therapists. This is a topic that I could talk about for hours, so I might just pause there and see if Mary has anything she wants to offer.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that if we had hours, I'm sure many of us would stay online to listen. Yeah, and I think it's really important. And like you said, we're naming the histories, right? Naming the communities, indigenous communities that have held these medicines sacred, had to hide them, had to protect them due to colonization and the systemic harms that have impacted folks all over the world. And so I think it is important to, for us all to do that work of understanding the histories and naming the different practices that we're, that are informing the ways that we are moving with these medicines, our different teachers. And so creating the space and creating the dialogue. And that can also be not only with our clients, but within our communities, right? And it's like, if we don't, right, we're being complicit, right, in the erasure of history, the erasure of this, of our Indigenous community members. And so really making space for ourselves to be humble in this process. I think Sarah just shared it so beautifully, of taking that time. And as we're doing that inner work, that we prioritize that piece as well. Because we are, all of us here have the potential to reenact those harms, right? And so we can, really integrate it as part of our learning and as part of the ways that we want to move these medicines as, as being carriers in the future. So thank you, Sarah, for diving right into that.
Yeah, thank you both for that. One of the things we touch on in our courses is really the cultural responsibility, of practitioners who do decide to take up this work, and it does involve a lot of history. We have time for one more question here. And so let's see, what practices have you found helpful to bring yourself back into presence when you've been triggered or when you've been stimulated? And how do you sort of stay in your own seat? How do you track what's happening in your experience?
Okay, go ahead and kick us off. I think that what emerges for me is that there's practices that I do during session, after, and before. And I think that there's the prep work really matters. So we think about this when we think about a psychedelic journey too. The prep work for our clients really, really matters, as does the integration work, right? It's not just all about the session itself. And I think the same thing about, tending to my own nervous system and resourcing for myself as well, is that there's things that I can do prior to, ahead of a session. And so for me, a lot of that is my own meditation practice and the consistency around that, and ensuring that I'm continuing to have a regular practice. That's been very, very helpful for me in my work with others and in my own personal work. And that has shifted and changed in terms of what that looks like and what forms and types of meditation that I'm exploring. But that is important. And not to sound like a broken record, but this goes back to the personal work too, is that I often find that the more that I'm tending to and caring for myself beyond self-care is very important, but I think it's a term that often is, it's lost some of its magic. So when I think about self-care, I think about, the fact that the more that I'm working on my own history and processing, the more I'm able to hold my seat, so to speak, with my clients, because I'm less likely to get triggered about something if I've done a fair amount of my own work around it, right? And then also recognizing that when things do come up and emerge during the session, that I'm taking those experiences and I'm integrating that, and I'm taking that whatever's learned. If something does kind of knock me off center, that I'm taking that into my own process afterwards, whether that's supervision. I think supervision is a really important part of this work. I have mentors in this field who've been working in it for 30 plus years, and they still receive regular individual or group supervision. I think that is huge, because we're really, everyone here who works in the mental health field, that when we're exposed to what our clients are working through, it's intense, and that's really amplified with psychedelics. The stories that we witness, the processes that we witness can be very intense and very overwhelming to our system. So the importance to afterwards have spaces where we can process that in safe containers for ourselves, including supervision. So I think I talked a little bit about like the preparation and integration, and Mary, maybe you want to speak to some of what you do during session, or answer it however you want.
Yeah, so, I will say that before I moved into this work, I had a lot of experience working with such a wide range and a diverse population. So doing community mental health and like working in the streets of San Francisco and, working in clinics. And I think for myself, I bring that up because part of that was my own development of building my own capacity. And so I really believe in being able to, right, have these different experience, whether it's clinical experiences and lived experiences, so that we can build capacity, right? So that we not only know how to navigate on this realm, that we can then navigate, right, in the medicine space. But something we want to remember is that when the medicine is activated, we feel it, right? It's present. And so, so the piece of like, how am I building that capacity, right? And Sarah mentioned meditation being a really helpful practice to integrate in our daily lives. For myself, I have a yoga practice. I like to spend a lot of time in nature, and I'm engaged with my own somatic practices. So I am often taking the time to notice what's happening in my system, connecting to my breath, right? And these for me are these little ways of just even noticing like, why, my hand is clenched. What's happening there? And, and coaching my hand, it's okay. You can relax, right? We're there, there's anything in this room that we need to worry about in this moment. And so, really inviting these grounding practices, really creating the container, as we talked about earlier, that supports us as well. So we may have the props and the different supports there for our client, but what is there for us as well? In the preparation, who are we asking for support? How are, is it, are we working with mantras or prayers or connection, the land offering? And as Sarah mentioned in the preparation work, just like we would do in going into a ceremony, are we turning down our social media or TV, the news, so that we can let that nervous system come down, and really taking care of ourselves. I'm a big fan of Epsom salt baths to really clear out my energy. And so it's really good for us to bring the awareness of our own practices, so that we then are creating the container to support us as well. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your experiences with us today. Such a great, great conversation. And we are going to spend about 10 minutes. Kabir is going to introduce our program. We have cohorts coming up. Mary and Sarah are both teaching on cohorts that are starting soon. And we'll be sharing some information about that and talking a little bit about our programs. And we'll answer any questions specific about our programs. So thank you both so much. We really appreciate you. Great, great conversation.
Certainly. Thank you so much. If any of y'all are interested in continuing conversations like these, have more questions specific to the webinar itself, our courses coming up are actually a wonderful time to voice those questions and continue the conversation. Relational Psychedelic Assisted Therapy is our flagship course. Applications for our March cohorts are due at the end of February. The application process is relatively quick, and our team, me specifically, is here to help you along the way. It is a 76-hour course that is both synchronous and asynchronous. We have what we call a flipped classroom model, so you'll be doing a lot of preparatory work online to then prepare yourself for live sessions that are really dedicated to relational and ethical skills practice, developing smaller communitas pods is what we call them, but groups of 4 or 5 folks that you can work with. And You'll have live sessions that are split up between full group live sessions and those Communitas Pod live group sessions. Again, it is a 21-week program over the course of just a little bit less than 5 months. And so that is a course that's fully built for people with active lives, whether it's jobs, school, family. We've designed this course to work within those constraints ideally. The live sessions are going to be on either Tuesdays or Thursdays and are 3 hours for the full group session and 1.5 hours for the Communitas Pod sessions. Again, the course is fully online with those synchronous and asynchronous components and currently priced at $3,995. We're running a discount for the new year. Hope to have some of you join us. If you have any questions about that, please, we'd love to answer them now. I'm also available to talk more in depth about course format, eligibility, tuition, anything like that. I'll go ahead and pop my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out and we can schedule some time to talk. With that said, I will hand it off to Deb to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the course.
Yeah, and if you go to the next slide, thank you. Yeah, so our approach to learning, and we've touched on this a little bit throughout this talk, but essentially, the psychological approaches that we've embedded in our course are psychoanalytical, psychodynamic, a very strong somatic thread throughout the course, because as we discussed in this call, there's a lot of somatic information that becomes important, especially when working in non-ordinary states, being able to work in, non-verbal ways, as well as transpersonal approaches. And in terms of educational theory, our courses are very learner-centered. So we take a guide on the side approach to learning where, we believe that all of you come with experiences in your own right, and we really co-create that learning experience together. It's embodied, which means that you're actually tapping into what's happening across your organization of experience. So not only, thoughts, not only cognition, not only learning information, but you're also tracking what is happening in your emotions, what is happening in your somatic experience that are related to those things, which again, as we've talked about in this conversation, are critical to providing psychedelic assisted therapy. In that same way, it's relational. As Kabir said, it's a flipped classroom, meaning that, the time that you do spend together with people is really important. So you can practice together, you can dive into conversations, demonstrations, and things like that. And it's constructivist, which again is just the idea that we all come with information, histories, experiences that really add to the learning experience. And then to go through what our modules are, which is on the next slide. If someone would move forward, please. Thank you. We've got an orientation and 6 modules. Each one is 3 weeks. The first one is really about communitas, liminality. That's that kind of in-between space, right? And that happens in therapy. It also happens in learning. It's that space of not knowing or transition. Basic psychedelic assisted therapy competencies, building resources. So akin to like therapy, when you would come in as a client, you'd take an inventory of your resources, build your resources. And the reason for that is you're going to be taking a look at a lot of your own stuff throughout this course, and you want to have those resources available to you, as well as building that container, which is important throughout. Module 1 is about establishing intentional practice, right relationship, and ethical considerations with psychedelic assisted therapy. The second module, indigenous and BIPOC uses of psychedelics, ceremony, mental models, and belief systems. Module 3 is really about contemporary research, but it's about the limitations of research as well, and sort of the paradigm shift of psychedelic assisted therapy. In module 4, we take a really deep dive into what is happening beneath the surface in the intersubjective field. So relational dynamics, transference, countertransference, enactments, a lot of those things that we touched on in this conversation today. And in module 5, we have a very special experience around a cacao ceremony that is follows the preparation, holding space, with cacao, and then transformation and integration stages as well. So you get to practice some of those skills with cacao and in your communitas pods. And in the final module, We're talking about community practice, clinical applications, closing the container. Also those transitions, ending transitions come up in that module, which we touched on a little bit in this conversation. These are the faces of some of our contributors, not all. You may recognize some of those names. And that is it, I think. We are happy to stay for a few more minutes and answer any questions you have about upcoming cohorts, about the course itself. Mary, Sarah, thank you again so much for being here. Thanks for your conversation. If you enjoyed that, we have another one coming up, so stay tuned.